This is the Hofstra Radio Alumni Audio Yearbook. Today is March 23rd, 2024. Please tell us your name and the years you were at Hofstra Radio.
So my name is Richard Friedman, and I was at Hofstra Radio from 1998 till about 2002.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us and coming to share your stories. While you were at the station, did you have any titles or positions?
I did actually. I was the production manager for about a year and a half, and I was actually the associate morning show producer for at least a semester. I'm not sure, maybe the full year, but yeah.
Okay. So aside from the morning show, what shows or programs did you work on at the station?
I worked on quite a bit. I was only officially cleared for the Rock and Roll Oasis. That
Oh,
was like the formal one that I created the tape for, and that was like my focus. And then I've done obviously the Wake Up Call, and the Jazz Cafe, the classics. Um, I did Aggressive Edge a handful of times. Um, I don't know if there's other shows that I recall. Uh, I used to do occasionally engineer for Out Behind the Barn for Irv.
uh-huh.
I don't know if you remember Irv Sibner.
I do very
Um,
well.
and Bosch's show also.
Yeah.
Uh, so pretty much whenever there was a gap in programming or someone needed help for that time period, I was usually involved in some way,
Very
if
cool.
possible.
Very cool. Sounds like a lot of different opportunities there. When you were on the air, did you have any nicknames or on-air personas?
Personas, no, I don't think so. The only term I've ever heard from people about production in general is just because I was so good at it early on that I know at least a couple of people call me like production god, and
Nice.
that was mostly because just the speed that I'd be able to produce something. And I remember I think I did a spot with EJ Kritz, and he was recording something, and then he left the studio, and I was in the production studio, and I left the studio, and he was still like packing up, and then he walked out of the hallway, and then he heard what he had what we were just working on, that wasn't fully produced. He just recorded his audio.
Uh-huh.
About 30 seconds later, as he was walking down the hall and he looked in the studio, then he saw me in the studio. He's like, "How did you?" And it was already behind music because I was just live mixing it. I just sort of walked into whoever into the main studio, and I used the shortcut, and like just dumped it on there, and then mixed it over whatever was transitioning on the music in that particular moment. But yeah, I used to do stuff like that every now and then, and uh, it sounded good, but not everybody was always happy that I would do that, and just it just like right in that moment, I was like, hold on a second, let me just take a hold of the board for a second. Whoever was there, and they usually didn't mind, but um,
So
yeah,
it sounds like you have just a natural feel for how to throw it together. Like you didn't have to think about it too much.
yeah. I mean, I had done it um, I, for a while already. Actually, before I started WRHU, um, I did production at my high school station, which
Oh,
was WKWZ in Syosset. Um, so, and I was there doing that since I was a freshman. So, and that was before they had, um, before it was digital. It was there. You're just splicing the tapes,
hmm.
with the tape media. And you probably remember this because you were there probably in the 90s. You remember
Yep.
before it was digital. It was just the real, the old reels.
Yep.
So,
Yeah, everything was reel to reel and grease pencils and razor
hmm
blades.
yep.
We were playing around with DAT recording a little bit, but still the vast majority of everything we did was on tape. So,
Yep.
just to refresh my memory, your high school radio station, did that share a frequency with another school, or am I getting that mixed up?
It was 88.5, and I
Okay.
believe it. I'm not sure if it's shared with Plainview.
That
Um,
was my thought, WPOB. So,
yeah, and that's how I had heard of another member of POB, which was he was a little older than me, Sean Novat,
Uh-huh. Yep.
and he was the station manager there. So and every single time I think maybe it could have been that. I think he worked during the day, and then they signed off, and then I would sign on at 2:30 right after school ends.
Mm.
It could have been that. It might have been a share. Now that you said that, I seem to
Yeah.
remember that.
Yeah, I remember a little bit about WPOB, and I remember that there's a frequency sharing. But let's go back a little bit to your high school days. What brought you to your high school radio station? Were your friends doing it? Was it something that always interested you?
Um, I didn't have any friends doing it. Interestingly enough, it was
Mm.
just we were thinking of like, well, what was the after school programs, and there's the chess club and mathletes, and then there's like, oh, they have a radio station. I'm like, that could be interesting. That sounds fun. And my interest was always I was always very computer driven. I would always like to build computers, and that sort of became more of my focus as I got older.
Mm.
But the interest in deep interest in music and just um, on working on the radio, obviously have access to a full enormous music library, and I think that sparked my interest also. Just it really helped to enhance my music knowledge. And
Yeah.
yeah, so I think those are the core reasons. And then I knew that, all right, well, eventually we'd be doing stuff like this on the computer. And they had a computer at my high school, but it was super old. It was barely able to play an MP3.
Yeah.
So it was just, it was like, all right, I could record something in Wave. I'm just like, I just need a little bit more power. It was like, it needed like another year. And then, first year of college basically is, uh, finally got access to a machine that could actually do stuff on a computer.
Yeah. So I guess you would have started high school in '94. Does that sound
Yeah,
right?
right. Yep.
So that
About
was right at that moment where because my graduating class was '94, and like I said, we did 95% of our stuff on reel to reel and a little bit with DAT, but not much. But as we got into the job market, everything on the commercial end was switching to computers and digital recording and things like that. So it
yep.
was a weird time because the computers didn't really have that much power or memory, as you were mentioning. But the expectation was as you were going into commercial radio, that's what you would have to do. So yeah, it was a very specific time and place, and that's yeah, I can sort of picture it all, and it hurts my heart and my brain a little bit, but it
and
was interesting
and you
times.
probably were playing most of things off records and not using CDs as much. I mean, they were
At,
probably fairly fairly new. I mean, that's like early '90s, but
yeah,
at our high school, we still had a huge record library. We probably my freshman sophomore year, we were playing. I'd say 70% of the stuff on records,
wow, okay. Yeah,
which was
we had CD players. In fact, we had multiple CD players at one point in the early '90s. But someone told me I think the first CD player made it to master control at WRHU in like 1989, maybe, which kind of surprised me.
yeah,
But
that would have been pretty much the time that I heard of CDs.
yeah,
I knew someone that they were very expensive, and there was only a
yeah,
handful, and super sensitive. Like, don't touch it on the bottom,
yeah,
only on the sides. Is like because it's gonna skip, and you had to pay attention. And you play a song on the air, and you had a scratch on that disc. It all of a sudden stop, skip, whatever, and then you'd have to quickly fade it out and switch to something else. So basically, from the time that you ended a song, you knew that, all right, and at least in the back of my mind, I had like 10 seconds to swap the disc out, through another disc in there and cue it
right,
up because of the possibility of that disc skipping. So you had to get really good at that. And obviously it happened on records too, with, all of a sudden records would skip too. So,
yeah.
but
Yeah, that's is a very specific time, and I appreciate that you mentioned the how expensive it was. The compact discs were $20 when at the same time cassettes were something like $7 or $8,
yep,
and
yep.
records were even cheaper. But yeah, it was that transition time. So that's interesting. So you're at the Syosset radio station, and my next question is, as always, I'm interested in what brought people to Hofstra Radio. So I guess as you're applying to colleges, were you thinking about Hofstra because of radio? Was that a coincidence? And what was it like when you got to the radio station for the first time? Do you remember meeting anybody or?
So I do. I So I guess there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
So I knew about Hofstra before I graduated from high school. I knew I was going to go there, and one of the reasons that interests me is because I had so much interest at of radio at that time from my high school that I was specifically looking for schools that had radio stations.
Mm,
And I had a lot of interest. My primary uh, reason for going to school was computer science, actually, and then I was interested in business, and then I knew that I'm like, all right, but then I also wanted to do the radio station. I was like, all right, well, how do I fit all this in, and what's going to be the priority? And Hofstra sort of fit the bill with having, a good business school, and they had a good computer science program, and one of the top communication schools in the country.
mm,
Um, so I went to WRHU before I graduated from high school, and I met Bruce. I met Ed Ingalls. I think I might have met Danielle, and I probably met Sean because he was the station manager at that time, Sean Novat.
right.
Um, and I basically expressed my interest to them. I think I already had applied, and then I was accepted to Hofstra, and I had a meeting. Um, I believe I had a meeting with Bruce and Ed at the time, and he basically said that, well, he basically explained the whole process that we had a training class in high school. We didn't really have a training class.
Yeah.
We had like a training class of three or a group of three where you find three. Oh, you got two friends that also want to join. All right, come to the station at 4:30 today, and they'll sit on the couch. And we'll explain how it works. It was just a very different process
Yeah. I
as
bet.
opposed to an actual class that met. I remember if it was maybe once or twice a week for throughout the entire semester with exams with the training class, and I think you had to have at least an 85 on that final test, from what I remember, and knowing everything from you know how to do an emergency test,
Right.
there's to knowing the fax number. And now people wonder, like, well, what's a fax machine? But yeah, you had to know those kinds of things. But yeah, I met with Bruce and Ed uh, early on about that, and they basically said, well, our class is full for this semester. I said, we rarely have incoming freshmen in the first semester training program. And I said, oh.
Hmm.
And then I explained why. I said, look, I had all this former experience. I was at my high school station, and they said, well, that's all well and good. I said, but we have a process here, and he was very nice about it. And I think part of it was like, um, he told me later that he felt that I was kind of like cocky about it, and
Ah.
like I felt I was like I should, like, how could you choose me, not have me in this, with all this previous experience and everything. But yeah, I went to the class in the second semester, um, and uh, um, and yeah, and then after the first thing I wanted to do after I finished that class was I wanted to get on the board to um, you know, t- to be production or program director. I think was on the executive board, but
Yeah.
production manager was on uh,
Administrative board, I
the
think.
administrative
AB.
board,
Yeah.
right? Hmm.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting situation to be in because you have experience and you've done stuff, and it's like I said, it seemed like you had a talent for doing production, and I guess you were walking in hoping like, well, put me on, I'm available next Thursday, right?
Exactly,
And then
because
there's this
because
whole
I didn't know
thing,
how it
yeah,
works. Because I said,
right.
I'm like, all right, well, we could have done that in high school. It was like, now it's this is just a very different process.
Yeah, there are college radio stations where you can walk in and be on in relatively short time, but the Hofstra training program is something different, especially under Bruce and Ed. Do you remember anything that you learned during that training class, or things that you were surprised about, or was it sort of like, okay, I get this, it's just a little bit more intense than what I did in high school?
Um, so the one thing I could tell you I remember from one of Bruce's classes is that the first thing he wrote on the blackboard was he wrote seven dirty words, and he was and he was referring to George Carlin's skit, and is basically highlighting the point that you can't curse on the air. And he's just like, this was something that happened during that time period, and it wasn't on the air, but it was basically like, we have to, make sure that we have no profanity and everything sort of follows, a very, very strict policy. I think Bruce put that into place, just sort of the formality of everything.
Right.
That um, I had heard a story that once that they I don't know if they put the classics in place because of this or the wake up call, or they just wanted to have the sound of um, the radio station sort of going through the campus. And I
Right.
know that the classics in the morning will go through the campus, and the wake up call does as well, because I believe that's, let's say, 8 to 10, I believe. Um, so they wanted to. It wasn't always like that, and they wanted to have the sound to popularize the radio station, so that they put the classics in place because of that. And everything that we had on the air, they said, well, if we were going to have it pumped throughout the campus, that it had to, can never have any profanity, at during that time especially, but any point in time, which was one of the
Right.
reasons why it was the classics during that time. Um, but yeah, I mean, the training class was fun. I enjoyed it. For me, it was almost like a little bit of a challenge, and just learning everything and the processes. And um, I felt that my background definitely helped
Right.
to about some of the more technical aspects, and the knowledge about the uh, frequency modulation, and the location of, say, where the transmitter was or how the transmitter worked. And no one ever went to Constitution Hall, but you still had to know that it was there.
Right.
Um, but
Interesting.
yeah,
Yeah, I wonder too about your. You kind of described your high school radio station a little bit, and then I guess you get to Hofstra and you see. I think during your time there was a significant upgrade in the equipment, but it must have been kind of cool and kind of interesting to walk into this college radio station and see the level of equipment. And how did that compare
yeah.
to what you
They,
had in
I
high
mean, they
school?
had they had a computer that was there, that was sitting near the board, and it was a relatively new board. And the board that I remember from our high school looked like it had been there for 30 years.
Right.
It just, all, scratched up, and just looked like a very old board. And I think the one um, in the main studio, at least, was easily twice the size. Um, with a lot of, they, like I mentioned, the shortcut, and they had the CDs. They had the real machine there as well,
Yeah.
but I rarely used it in in college at that point. I think it was just there, and they weren't going to pull it out, I suppose. I doubt it's there now, but
I've
but
heard rumors that someone has kept a reel-to-reel machine in there just to keep people on their toes.
just to
But
remember that
I
this is what
yeah,
it was. No,
yeah.
no one uses. Yeah.
I can't confirm that, but I've heard rumors. I'll have to go back and check someday. Do you remember getting on the air the first time at WRHU, or was it just sort of like I've done this before? It's kind of old hat.
Um, the first time. Honestly, probably not, and maybe that's because of the reason why.
Uh-oh.
It was more of the almost being annoyed by the process at that time. Just,
Uh,
I was like, oh, to be on the air, you got to create a tape, and I was like, all right, fine. And then I'll go into the production studio. I'll just create it. It was sort of just, for me, it was like going through the motions. The production studio one was actually, it wasn't bad. It was pretty close to the one that was in the main studio as far as the mixing board, and there was a small Mackie that was next to it. Um, but yeah, I mean, I just been using boards for so long, so I didn't think anything of it really. It's just, all right, let's go and record. And yeah, I just felt very comfortable behind the board. Um, when I used to do the wake up call, I was almost always behind the board. I don't think I ever sat on the other side.
huh. When you were in high school, did you do when the station's not on the air? Did you have a chance to like practice your production skills? Was it stuff that you were thinking about and saying, "I want to make promos and PSAs and music pieces"? Was that something that you practiced, or is that again just something in your head that you thought you could do?
In high school, uh, we actually had a separate board, and so during class, or in between classes rather, or let's say on my lunch hour, I would
Mm,
head down there and go into the production studio. And it was easier to do that than to just come after school, even if I
right,
wasn't on the air.
right.
And then I would record. I remember even I had a specialty show. They asked, if we wanted to create some original programming. And for anybody who's actually thinking about original programming, this was a great idea. I said, well, let me do a show about video games. And because I did that, I contacted Sony and I contacted Nintendo, and I basically said, "Well, I'm a member of the press,"
Uh-huh.
and they sent me a PlayStation and a bunch of games, and I got games from Nintendo, and I would just review them on the air in a program that and I thought, a 16, 17-year-old, I'm like, this is great. I was like, I'm getting free games.
Yeah.
I don't know why I didn't really continue that I think I wanted to actually bring that to WRHU, but everything, like I said, it's very rigid with the programming. It was not sort of a, well, well, Rich, what do you want to do? I
Right.
think they had something like that. They had like freeform programming, but it was at like 1 in the morning. I was like, all right, I'm not doing it. So
Understood. That's a pretty ambitious idea for a high school student and getting that swag and getting those benefits of it. Did you understand? Did you realize at the time that this is a pretty fortunate situation that you're in to have a high school radio station and the ability to do this? Do you think you appreciated it?
when you're that young, you're not thinking about that.
Yeah.
You're thinking like, oh, this is great that I can do that. Um, you're not thinking that you're privileged at all when you're in that situation. You're thinking this is totally normal.
Right.
And the only other reference that I had was, let's say, Plainview School, which I knew who also had a station. So I just sort of assumed, well, everybody else has a station. This school has a station. I guess everybody's got a station. And
That would be pretty
you
cool.
know, yeah.
Who else was around in those early days as you're getting used to the station? You mentioned Sean and Ed and Bruce. Do you remember any other people who maybe helped you get settled at the station or that you listened to and went, oh, they're doing a cool thing, or any other names?
Let's see. There was Danielle DeLillo was around a lot.
Hmm.
Um, Casey Miles. Casey Miles sort of amazed me just because I can never, for at the time, I can never tell how old he was. And everybody said that, oh, he's been here for so many years. And then he was still there even after I graduated. And I was like, how old is this guy? It's like, how? And he was cleared for everything. So he was almost like what I wanted to be because he just knew. He took me around the station. He showed me everything. And I think he cleared me probably for the Oasis and the cafe and the classics. And I don't know if he was a production manager at all. I think that was a different guy.
Uh-huh.
Dan Rakowitz, I think, was
Uh-huh.
the
Yep.
production manager at the time. And Casey was just always around. He might have even been program director. Um, but yeah, so I remember him, and Danielle was a big contributor. She still is.
Yeah.
I get stuff from her all the time. Um, but yeah, I mean, those initial days, those are the two, or a couple that stand out. And
Obviously you were pretty comfortable doing production and being on the air. Do you remember a moment where you felt comfortable at the station where you're like, okay, I really enjoy being here, I'm going to spend a lot of time here? Was there a social moment or a social time where you felt like, okay, I belong here?
um, I felt pretty comfortable immediately. Everybody sort of took to me, and everyone was real nice. And um, I remember like Sean basically saying that, like, yeah, he hadn't specifically heard of me, but he knew my skill set, and he's just like, I heard that you'd make like an amazing production manager, um, and so that sort of got me excited, and everybody was just really, really accepting and willing for me to take the next level, which I think I did. Not, I don't know if I went. There might have been a semester gap
Hmm.
between. I don't think it was my first semester Frosh sophomore year, but definitely second semester sophomore year. I definitely would have been a production manager at that point.
Okay.
Um, but I remember meeting with uh, Bruce about it, and um, I was thinking more like executive board at the time. And he's just like, well, it's, you're still like, I was probably, maybe it was first semester. It might have been first semester, sophomore year. And he's like, we really don't have that ever happen. He told me afterwards, he's like, he could have potentially wowed us
Yeah.
and gotten on the executive board. And I thought to myself, well, in my mind, it's like, I didn't really see how, but, that was always my goal. But everybody was really nice and, and really accepting and to help. And especially since I felt, everybody on RHU that I had worked with for the most part was a journalism major, or they majored in radio specifically, and they were in some of my radio classes. But because I was also doing computer science, that wasn't as much of my focus, and I think that sort of caused like a shift as I as the years went on at Hofstra, for me anyway.
It's probably not fair, and maybe I'm reading too much into this, but the first time you show up, they tell you there's no room in the training class, come back later, and then you express an interest for being on the EB, and Bruce says, well, come back later, and
Yeah,
some people talk about the amount of encouragement they get, and it sounds like you're actually kind of like discouraged a little bit. Is that fair?
I sort of, yeah, I wouldn't say I was totally discouraged. Part of it was there was, like I said, like almost like a sense of entitlement, and I think Bruce didn't want me to have that, and he really liked me, and I met with him on the side, multiple times about things, how things were going in school. Like, he really took an interest. He wasn't just, someone that I just felt was very closed off. He was, he was the kind of person that he would always have his door open, and he was great to talk and meet with, and he just wanted to, I think, from me, to get that sense of entitlement out a bit and be like, all right, you belong here, but you kind of have to earn this. You can't just expect that because you know how to program and you feel comfortable, and you could probably maybe you could outdo everybody here, that you deserve it and you should just be given it just because.
Got it.
So
Got it. Yeah, I mean, there's some amount of tough love in the job of running a college radio station, and not everybody gets to do the things they want to do. But you talked about being production manager. How exciting was that? Was it a lot of fun? Was it what you wanted it to be when you started doing that?
yeah, I was thrilled. I was looking at, I remember all the sound effects tapes, and I had looked at like the stuff that Dan, who came before me, used to do. And I was like, all right, well, I'd listen to like a lot of Z100 and the promo spots that they would do, and I would just try to emulate that as best as I can. And I would always try to challenge myself and get very picky on the, sometimes the echo, the reverb that was on something, and everything had to be tight in my mind, that it just had to be like just very exact. If something flowed in, if something ended on a downbeat, that it couldn't like skip a beat a little bit, or the transition had to be good. Like, I wanted to get everything as perfect as I possibly could.
Right.
And so, like, in my mind, that was like my inner challenge, and to do that, okay, what could I do different, production wise, initially starting with the Rock and Roll Oasis, and then, just different, promos and PSAs. I think PSAs were a little limiting as far as
Right.
that. It's pretty much just the audio recordings, but promos, it was sort of like the sky's the limit on the stuff that you can do. And that's actually why I shared that one with you.
Has your breakfast conversation been silly lately?
If you've been looking for some new morning companionship, WRHU has the solution to your problem.
On March 15th, not only will you be able to get a great breakfast, but you might even get a chance to express your point of view on the air.
Join the Thursday morning crew and a special guest or two as they bring you Hofstra's Morning Wake Up Call live from the Colony Diner in East Meadow.
Put somebody in jail for 6 months for squirting his dean with silly string?
Yeah, is
silly string that like bad that it's gonna hurt you?
If I squirted you with silly string, would you charge me with
I'd beat
battery?
the living daylights out of you.
All right. You wouldn't bring up battery charges, would you?
No, you probably would after I'd be done with you.
Breakfast and banter, live from the Colony Diner.
Be part of the Intelligent Irreverence with Hofstra's Morning Wake Up Call live at the Colony Diner on Hempstead Turnpike in East Meadow, Thursday, March 15th from 7 to 9 a.m. on 88.7 FM, Radio Hofstra University.
I should have asked this to you of you earlier. Were you listening to commercial radio stations in high school and college? Were there stations or DJs or production guys that caught your ear or inspired
Well, I
you?
mean, everybody listens to Stern.
Yeah.
Sometimes for the wrong reasons. I listened to a lot of Z100, and at that time a lot of K-Rock, and just the overall announcements and how their transition was between songs. So I looked for that, and as to try to as a means to make myself a little bit better, and just practice like the way that I would say WKWZ,
Yeah.
or the way I would say WRHU, as I got older. But the only name really that comes specifically is Stern.
Yeah.
Which wasn't known for that. I was just more of like almost like the wrong reason to listen to radio, other than like just like the kinds of things that you could hear on the radio for content wise. But yeah, I mean, I'd always listened to radio for a pretty long time, and my parents would always talk to me about stories of them listening to radio when they were growing up, and then how that was like the primary medium, and how stories were initially told specifically on the radio. And I even remember having audio classes where we were trying to mimic those kinds of productions and stories, where we have to like almost like act out a live show. And some of that to like probably pay homage to that time period, but also understand sound and the artistic nature of sound and sound mixing, and how you were to come up with a show where a horse is galloping, and how you were going to make that sound, and I always found that to be really interesting. And just trying to come up with a way of hitting the desk, or maybe it was your hand, or something like that. And sometimes if you can't find the right sound effect, that all right, figure out a way to make a weird noise on the table,
Right.
and then that could be like their transition, especially, or run it backwards and throw some filter over it, and that could be an effect, and can really get creative.
Yeah. It sounds like you had some really high standards and some creative ability, and it seems like, at least in some sense, the radio station was meeting that for you. Is that fair?
Yeah. It gave me that opportunity to be creative, and it was at Hofstra, definitely was a place that I would probably fill the time. I wasn't so much the person that would say go to the library, but let's say in between, I had a class between, or 2-hour break between classes. The immediate stop was at WRHU, and I'd sit in the production if it was, assuming no one else was in there, and just do something, either work on something or try to create something. There was always something that could be created. It wasn't like a point where like, oh, well, I did everything that could ever be done.
Right.
So, yeah.
So how is that, being production manager and spending time and doing on-air shifts? How is that working with your other studies? Because some people come in specifically for broadcasting or journalism, but you're thinking computer science. So was there friction between those two, or difficulty managing your time?
Well, I mean, from a skill set, I think that was probably one of the reasons why I was so good specifically at production, is just because my just general nature of computer knowledge, combined with just general, my general audio skill set, and that just what made for me for it to be a pretty good production manager. But just from a study standpoint, I don't think it mattered too much. I didn't put that much time overall into the station, where I actually thought it wasn't like studying. It
Yeah.
wasn't like I had to study for anything there. It was just like, if anything that was, let's say, exam based, would have been probably oral at the time. I mean, I had those AVF classes, and um, it was all basically based on production and things that you would have to make ahead of time, and so you'd have projects effectively, and then that was your your midterm or your final exam, at least for the classes that I had. Perhaps
Right.
outside of, say, your public speaking classes, um, and that helped me a bit to become better on the air, just to speak better, clearer, try to not say words like or stutter,
Mm-hmm.
or try to speak as clear as possible. And sometimes it's better to pause as opposed to just say and it comes out naturally for a lot of people.
Sure.
And that has actually helped me probably the most throughout my career past Hofstra,
Uh-huh.
is just the fact that I was on the air, and that constant use of speaking has helped me be, let's say, a better manager in my career. And because it's always something, it's always a tool that you always have to work on and that gets better over time. But this was definitely a big help.
Hmm. Obviously, you came into Hofstra and the radio station with some ambitions and an idea of what you wanted to do. But I'd like to sort of bring it back here. When you first walked into the radio station, what did you think Hofstra Radio would mean for you, and what did it become?
So I was pretty undecided at the time. Like I said, I knew I went for computer science, but I didn't have really one over the other. So I was thinking, okay, I could be, this could be my primary job. That,
Yeah.
one day I'll work on, uh, I'll work at Z100, or maybe I'd work at K Rock, which is of course no more. But those were like the biggest stations at the time, and maybe in the summer, if with the experience of working at WRHU, that I can get an internship at Z100. Um, and so that's how I was thinking in my mind, is that I wasn't 100% focused or all in on computer science or business at that time.
Hmm.
Everything was still very much up in the air. And I knew I enjoyed the radio station, and I knew that I was good at it, and it wasn't that much of an effort in my mind, as opposed to, say, computer science, which I knew was going to be tough. I
Yeah.
knew I'd have to put a lot of time in and study, and um, as good as natural that became, there was always going to be a part that was always going to challenge me, and perhaps to a point that I may had to choose, and that eventually happened. But working on the radio, that was all very natural for me.
Hmm.
I just felt comfortable.
Very cool. Well, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for sharing your stories. I have a feeling you have some more stories, and I have some more questions. Maybe we can do this again sometime.
Great. It was Brian, great talking to you, and looking forward to a next talk.